You can freely float firewood down a river. Sending it back up is a problem. Grain travels in every direction to feed a city. Load it onto a ship and it crosses the ocean. Put timber in that same place and half your city will freeze to death during winter. Transporting more of it simply costs too much, unless the transport is free. Drop a log in the river and the current does the rest. That flow determines how warm your city stays through winter, and whoever sits on top of it holds power. To know how you can use that power in your world, I've made a worksheet, but more on that at the end of the video. Every single city runs on two main supplies: food and heat. We've learned that it is possible to cheat the first one, like how Rome was fed by Egypt through the Mediterranean Sea. Grain is dense enough to transport in bulk overseas. Heat isn't that easy to pack so tightly. A cord of firewood is 128 cubic feet of stacked firewood. It leaves little room for anything else. It's heavy and bulky. Even though it's cheap, it's never really worth carrying very far. Where grain can cross an ocean, firewood barely leaves the chopping block. A city burns only what grows within a cart's reach of its walls. Your forest caps your population. Contrary to calories, fuel is a stricter master. Where grain can travel across the open sea with ease, raw fuel hates to travel long distances. It costs too much. Try to move it overland, the ox paradox eats the cargo. Sometimes literally, sometimes financially. Where grain can survive the trip financially because it concentrates calories, firewood concentrates nothing. It is pure bulk, and moving it overland becomes an expensive trip. There's one way out and it runs downhill. Drop a log in a river and the current carries it for free. Medieval foresters lived on this. Rafts ran down the Vltava during the 11th century. By the early modern period, whole forests floated down the Rhine to feed the shipyards of Holland. I call it the gravity subsidy. The river moves the cargo for free, as long as the cargo only goes down. The downhill rule is simple. Raw fuel is free in the direction the water flows, and expensive in the other one. A city downstream of a forest has fuel. A city upstream has to get creative. Once you strip the wood from a region, you don't simply find another fuel source. You burn whatever the ground left behind. The ground has decided that long before humans settled down. Where a forest stands, people burn wood. It is the default fuel and the very first thing to be consumed. At places where the wood runs out, but the land stays cold and wet, you can cut peat, a fuel-hungry and low-yield heat source. It is simply dried earth. In Ireland, the Netherlands and the Scottish bogs, this was the default. In places where they burn peat, it is the sign of a place that has lost its forest or never grew one in the first place. In places where there is neither tree nor bog, the steppe burns dung and sometimes crop stubble. The size of the fire is directly proportionate to the size of the herd. These places can never build heavy industry, because nothing it burns sustains the heat that it would need. But under some of the ground sits coal. And coal is the exception that ends the chain. It deserves its very own chapter, because it breaks the ceiling entirely. But first there's one more thing the forest can provide. Raw wood cannot smelt iron. The trouble is not the temperature. An iron furnace requires carbon that is pure enough to strip oxygen out of the ore, and it requires the fuel to be hard enough to bear the crushing weight of it stacked above it, without collapsing into dust and choking the draft. So raw wood is simply too weak and too dirty for both of these things. But when you cook wood in a slow starved burn, it results in a light, hard and clean fuel that consists only of carbon. Charcoal. It takes 5 to 7 tons of wood to make 1 ton of charcoal. So charcoal is basically a concentrated forest. The result is a purer carbon product. However, it is still quite brittle, and transporting it over long distances would grind it to dust before it arrives at its destination. This keeps the region locked. Every fuel-hungry trade must be close to the production source. The bulk stays home and the value travels. Now, you cannot haul 5 tons of wood to a furnace, but what if you moved the furnace to the wood? You make a kiln next to the forest and it gives you the charcoal that's much better to transport. Your city needs it to smelt iron, but it can only smelt as much as the coppice can feed. The fuel ceiling is not determined by the ore, but the fuel source, in this case, charcoal. Once the nearest woods cannot keep the pace anymore, the ironworks will move to a fresh forest. But Not only iron is worked in the trees. A glass house burns wood by the wagon load and sits in the forest, or the timber and the ash that goes into the glass itself. A salt boiler sets up his pans where the fuel is. They bring in brine water to the fuel. The fuel does not travel, the industry comes to the fuel. So politically, the one who holds the charcoal can make iron, and iron makes the weapons. So whoever holds the charcoal holds leverage over everyone else. Now, back to the forest you're trying not to lose. A city does not burn the forest at an even rate. It retreats with every tree you burn. First you start with the closest, then further and further, slow enough that no one notices when the forest grows more and more distant. Every cartload needs to travel further, and the ox paradox compounds with every ring of trees you felled. Fuel is a supply that grows more expensive when a city grows. Unlike grain. Grain comes from the same place every harvest, but fuel slowly retreats further and further from the city. It takes a decade to regrow the rings of trees. That makes firewood the number to watch. When the forest retreats, its price climbs. And the city might be in trouble before anyone has named it trouble. There is, however, a way to hold the rings still. Cut many species to the stump and they grow up fresh shoots, ready to cut again in 7 to 20 years. It rotates the cuts across the woodland and turns the forest into a battery that recharges on a fixed cycle. The alternative to coppicing is to cut everything and then burn it. That city gets one enormous fuel burst, but then a huge cliff. The new shoots never come. The rich soil gets washed off the bare hills because there are no trees to hold it there anymore. Rivers might silt and flood, and resulting in the cropland downstream dying together with the forest. You get fuel, but you pay a heavy price for it. The problem is that people never stop needing fuel. It is used for cooking all year round, wherever you are. The climate decides whether the fuel is used for warming during the cold winter month. In northern cities pays a heating tax every single year, while cities of equal size on the Mediterranean barely touch their forests for warming heat. Inland cities without access to rivers, cold, fuel poor, and landlocked is the worst place to be on a map. The fuel source sits on a fixed location, and whoever sits on it decides who stays warm. Heat is their weapon. It is the forest lord who controls the timber, the game within the woods, and the fuel of every hearth in his reach. Rulers knew this and guarded their forests closely. They established royal forest law, which did two particular things. It reserved the game and restricted the felling. The people who lived by the forest edge had to fight for their old right to gather deadwood and graze the underbrush. One of these fights happened in 1217, when the Forest Charter was signed, a document the people forced the King of England to sign so they could get back the public lands and resources he had taken for himself. When the Forest Lord cuts the fuel to a city during winter, it freezes. It's not exactly a siege, but it is just as final. The lack of fuel becomes the thing that kills. Without it, there can be no city. The Forest Lord, just as most other people in power, he is geographically bound. But the Forest Lord's power has its own ceiling. When a forest disappears, so does he. Then something new is needed to replace the fuel. And that is exactly what happened. Wheat is stored sunlight, one summer packed into a seed. Charcoal is that same sunlight concentrated by fire. Then there is coal. Coal is sunlight of a long time ago. Whole forests that grew, fell, and got compressed underground across millions of years. Coal is the fossil of concentrated sunlight. It gives people means to not cut down the living forest, but burn the forest of an age long gone. And the best part is that coal travels like grain does. It's dense, valuable, it can ride the sea, and on top of that, it cannot rot. Newcastle dug coal from the Tyne and shipped it down the coast to London. That is the parasite city's trick applied to fuel. Rome ate another continent's grain, a coal city burns another region's buried forests. The fuel ceiling is no longer bound to local fuel, and that brings huge potential. But don't be mistaken, coal is not some sort of magic key. Song China already hit this fuel source way before the Industrial Revolution happened in Great Britain. It burned through the northern forests and made the switch to coal. By the end of the 11th century, China ran the largest iron industry in the world. The West could not match it for centuries. However, where China started using coal, it did not make the transition to the modern world. The breakthrough of coal died with the fall of the dynasty. So coal may seem amazing, but in reality it is not that clean. Unlike a clean forest that gives you wood, for coal, the problems already start at the source, mines. If they're not ventilated, then a miner chokes on carbon monoxide. The shafts trap gas, flood, collapse. A miner can try to light his candle but detonate methane instead. This is called fire damp. Miners dealt with all these dangers just so raw coal could be brought to the carts that would take it to the city. The problems didn't stay in the mines though. They rode along with the coal, everywhere it went. Raw coal is a very dirty fuel source. Too dirty for ironworks. It's contaminated by sulfur and all sorts of toxins. When sulfur gets heated up, it can mix atmospheric moisture and cause acid rain. And acid rain will eat away at your buildings and destroy your crops. So your city is never safe. One good harvest can suddenly turn sour after one rainfall. You cannot control the weather, nor the gases that escape the fires. So when Bob's wife takes some coal to light the hearth, those same fumes spread through the room. Their chimney isn't that great, so it doesn't vent all of the smoke. Some houses had more than one fireplace, and every room suffered the same problem. Every house became a toxic inhaler. Before they reach their 30s, Bob and his wife get sick. Coal miners get black lungs. All because coal is so unclean. And on top of that, all of these trace elements make iron extremely brittle and therefore basically useless. There is a solution, and that solution is coke, not the Escobar kind. By heating up the coal in an oxygen-deprived environment, all the dirty materials escape through the air until only pure carbon remains. Coke. This is what kicked off the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Abraham Darby introduced coke in 1709. Coal shattered the fuel ceiling. So even though coal is not a magical key that fixes all your problems, it is still a necessary step to break through that ceiling. Britain was not the first to ride on the coal train, but they were the first to keep it going. They chained cheap coal to iron, iron to engines, engines to more coal. The loop fed itself. It's not just about the coal. Song China had coal, they just lacked the chain. Which brings us back to the river. A raft of firewood floats down and is arduous to pull back up. Every wood-burning city is a prisoner of its own forest. Coal is the only fuel that broke that rule. Until civilization finds it and follows it all the way through, the law holds without exception. To build this into your own world, I have a free worksheet available. We'll go through it step by step. Step 1. Fuel sources. You should start by marking the fuel sources, any that your world has. Forests, peats, bogs, and whatever coal your geology gives. Also decide how your forests are cut. Coppiced or clear cut. The heavy burning industries such as the ironworks, glass houses and salt pans will be put next to the trees where the fuel is. Step 2. Fuel radius. Next, draw the fuel radius around each fuel source. That range is stretched wherever a river will let it float downstream on a raft. When drawing the radius, mind the value of the source you're dealing with. Timber is less valuable than charcoal, and charcoal is less valuable than coal. This will help determine how far it's worth carrying. Number 3. Heat tax. Depending on the climate, you have the option to set a heat tax. This is a price that every citizen has to pay for being allowed to keep their hearths lit. You can decide how much it costs and what it funds. 4. The hook. Mapping all of this out already fuels your story, pun intended. The capital that looks unbeatable can be one winter away from collapse. Forest lord grows richer than the king because he owns the iron, the kingdom is strangled by a fuel embargo without a single battle being fought, and the rival across the border who finds coal first wins the arms race, while everyone else is still counting trees. The worksheet is available on my website and in my Discord server. I invite you to join the community so you can share your results. For now, have a good one, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.